Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
And I'm Jason Rosoff, and today we're going to be discussing a philosophy that's become almost mythical in tech circles, and that we're watching play out in real time in the US government. This philosophy is often referred to as the move fast and break things approach to work, and when this approach is effective and when it might lead us astray. So with that, let's get going.
I have to say, Jason, that one of my favorite photos, and we will put it in the show notes, comes from a friend of mine who used to work at Facebook, which is the company that coined this move fast and break things. And the news sign was slow down and fix your shit. Move fast and break things is, in my book, sort of obnoxiously aggressive. However, at Google, we called it launch and iterate. It seems to me to be a better way to say the good part of this, which is that if you're so afraid of never making a mistake, you can't innovate, you can't fix things. It's sort of the ethos behind Whoops-a-Daisy, which is publicly saying, oh, I messed that one up, and I'm going to do better next time. Another way to say the good part of this is something that is on the bottom of a friend of mine's email, make new mistakes. So I think that it needs to be okay to make a mistake. You can't innovate if it's not okay to make a mistake. It even needs to be okay to admit mistakes in situations where it's really not okay to make mistakes, like hospitals. This is what's behind Amy Edmondson and her book, The Fearless Organization. A lot of the research she did behind psychological safety is if you can't admit a mistake, if you can't share a mistake, then you're doomed to make it over and over again. Paradoxically, the hospitals where the most mistakes were reported were also the safest hospitals, which was not what she expected. That's my response. When I hear move fast and break things, especially in the context of firing lots of people, it feels evil to me.
There was a very concrete example of this, and there's an excerpt which we'll try to find for the show notes of one of the cabinet meetings where Elon Musk is talking about making
First
mistakes.
of all, what's he doing in a cabinet meeting? He's an unelected bureaucrat. The fact that he was in the room is an example of moving fast and breaking things when they should be slowing down and fixing their shit.
He said jokingly that he said, we're going to make mistakes. Like, for example, we cut all the funding to Ebola research, and then we realized, whoops, we probably should have kept the funding for Ebola research. So we turned that funding back on. That clip makes it seem sort of reasonable, but it doesn't capture the whole picture. Part of what's happening is that the uncertainty of grant money is unwinding programs. So it's not just like the absence, it's not that a short-term absence of funding has no effect. In some cases, they were so dependent on the next distribution of money that they literally had to stop experiment midstream. And so if there were live samples of something, for example, they couldn't afford to keep those, frozen. So those samples went bad. There's a real effect.
A real cost to that mistake.
Correct. Credit where credit's due, realizing that was a stupid decision and it needed to be undone. One of the things I would like to add to your list of things to look out for when considering a sort of ship and iterate is, what is the cost? What are the side effects of negative outcomes? Because if the side effects are significant or potentially very costly, then it's much more prudent to slow down and make sure you're making the right decision.
Yeah, exactly. Launch and iterate was about search results. It did not apply to a nuclear power plant, for example.
Right.
You would not want to launch and iterate at a nuclear power plant. You want to make damn sure that you're not going to blow up a major metropolitan area or any area. You got to test and test and test. Apple was not a launch and iterate kind of culture, because they were making hardware. So you couldn't just push a fix out. And once you have sold this phone to someone, you can't really fix it very easily, very cheaply anyway. It's not just a matter of pushing a software patch out. And they tested it and tested. Apple was much more of a measure 100 times cut once kind of culture, which is not to say that it wasn't innovative. Apple's obviously incredibly innovative. So you don't have to launch and iterate, to be innovative, and you certainly don't have to move fast and break things.
The cost of failure calculation, I think you're right. There are some times in human history where we took great risks with people's lives because the cost of failure was even higher. I think it's important to put everything on a spectrum. So, like when we were testing aircraft, there are all these people who put their lives at risk to test this aircraft. Even though
Yeah,
they were testing to try to get it right, the cost of failure was still high, like test
very
pilots
high.
in testing these aircraft. But the work that they did wind up putting us in a position to be able to turn the tide of World War II. The potential for success was great. But the thing that they did really well was they were very clear headed about the cost of failure, meaning they
Yeah.
understood that they were putting people's lives at risk. And they said, we're measuring that against the good that we think this can do. And it's not that when people do that, they always get it right, but that's a pretty big difference. We undid Ebola funding.
'Cause he's not gonna bear that cost.
Correct.
Musk is not gonna bear it, and part of the problem with what's happening is that part of the American experiment was checks and balances, right? Our governmental system put checks and balances in place so that the president didn't have too much power, the Congress didn't have too much power, the judiciary didn't have too much power, they could check each other's power. And unfortunately, those checks and balances are being undone before our
Mhm.
very eyes. And then it becomes impossible to hold people accountable for the cost of failure. If you fail, there should be some accountability for failure. That's the problem with having an unelected bureaucrat in these cabinet meetings.
One of the issues with move fast and break things, even if you're aware of the potential negative impact of failure, is that it's often quite hard to measure the full cost of failure. If your attitude is like, there doesn't need to be accountability for failure, you have this careless attitude, you wind up being much more susceptible to the measurement problem. It is very hard to measure the things that really matter when you're doing these calculations. Slowing down to really consider what the externalities of what we're doing actually are for you to realize, oh, it may not be so simple as just turning the funding back on. We may
Yes.
be setting ourselves back if we do this in this way.
I also like size matters. And a lot of the launch and iterate and even the move fast and break things culture came from a world in which these companies were small. When they started saying launch and iterate, it didn't really matter if Facebook made a mistake in the early days because Facebook didn't really matter in
Mm.
the early days. Now, as we have seen, it's having a huge impact on the psychological well being of all of us, polarization. In Myanmar, a genocide was planned on Facebook. Mistakes really have real world terrible human consequences. And I've been thinking, I've been doing a fair amount of retrospection about my career in tech and what has gone wrong in recent years. I may even have to go back to the first job I had out of business school at the FCC in 1996. When the Telecom Act came out, Section 230 is a section of the Telecom Act of 1996. Section 230 explicitly lets social media platforms, lets tech platforms off the hook for any accountability for content moderation. In 1996, even then it was sort of questionable writing this blank check to this new industry. But I understand what we were thinking at the time. We were thinking it doesn't make sense to regulate tech companies that don't even exist yet. In 1996, Google hadn't even been founded, and I think Zuckerberg was in 3rd grade or so. These platforms didn't exist at the time. There was some sense to it, but I wish we hadn't written this blank check for all time because now this check is coming due and we can't afford to pay it. At this point, it is time to hold these companies accountable for the harm that the content on these platforms does. You raised one of my favorite topics of all time, the measurement problem. Like, part of the issue is that if you're measuring engagement, very important to Facebook's business because the more engaged users are, the more likely people are to contribute content to Facebook and Instagram. And people tend to engage more with negative content, with negative emotions, which is why these
Mhm.
platforms spew more fear of missing out, more deeply enraging content that polarizes us all, more content about eating disorders, all of these kinds of things, because we pay attention to these things. And so
Right.
they're just kind of tracking what they can measure. Very hard to measure the value of a well-functioning society. And that doesn't factor in clearly to their even though in the end, if society dissolves, it'll kill the goose that lay the golden eggs.
I spent many of the formative years of my career in Silicon Valley working at a nonprofit at Khan Academy. And I will say we thought a lot about these externalities. What
Yeah.
does it mean to give this
Sorry,
away?
can I interrupt? Can you explain what an externality is?
Oh, sure. A side effect is maybe a simpler way to say it. The side effects of what we were doing, Khan Academy was providing free world-class educational content. We were mostly fine with that because most of the other people who were providing content were educational publishers. We didn't think the educational publishers were doing a great job of providing great content for teachers and students to use. We were conscious of the fact that there may be some side effects, right? For example, as much as we might not like to think about it this way, a textbook you can use for many years. Many students can use a textbook, and you don't need
Yeah.
internet access to use a
Yeah.
textbook. We were conscious of the fact that if we were successful and undermined this other way of getting access, it had the potential of exacerbating inequities in the system.
Yes.
Even though it would be done for all the best reasons and there wasn't a profit motive, we were giving it away for free, but there are these potential side effects of what we were doing. And what that caused us to do was to build partnerships with people who were bringing free or very inexpensive internet access, very inexpensive computing to schools in the US and around the world. We thought about how do we make sure that if we're successful, we don't wind up just giving great access to rich kids who already had all the
Yeah.
things they needed.
And how much time do you think Facebook spends worrying about that particular issue? I'm sure there are people at Facebook who care deeply about this. I do not mean to dismiss everyone who works at Facebook. I have friends who work at Facebook or Meta.
Yeah.
I certainly don't mean to cast aspersion on all these people. But if you're making that argument, and meanwhile, these other metrics are making all the money, the argument that this thing you care passionately about is likely to get lost in the noise.
Yes, I was going to say the exact same thing. I think there's a benefit of, like the Khan Academy relied on donations, so that limited our scope and our ability to grow. And that meant it was easier to keep people aligned around the mission, and it was easier to center these conversations around making sure that we were actually achieving the mission and not just reinforcing the inequities that were already there. And so I do imagine that there are some people at Facebook who are every day having a discussion about how can they help to fix some of the problems that social media as a medium has created and all this other stuff. But
there are at Google, like this great program, Grow with Google, where Google is trying to offer content to people to learn skills that will help them get jobs.
Right. It exists everywhere, but not at the core of the machinery. It exists on the periphery as these organizations grow. Back to the measurement problem, what's measured is managed, right? So if short-term profits are measured, if engagement is measured, those are the things that wind up being managed against. I think you're totally right that the long-term play is a bad one. If it actually undermines society and people become so disgusted with it that they leave these platforms, then they have no users left, so they can't make any more money.
Yeah.
But I think consideration at the periphery as opposed to at the core.
Part of the problem is not only the metrics that drive Facebook's business, but also the market. If the market rewards quarterly earnings, it's really hard to worry about the downstream impact of your product. I don't mean for this to be a Facebook bashing, Google promoting podcast. But when I took the job at Google in 2004, you can feel free to push back and tell me I had drunk the Kool-Aid. But Larry and Sergey said, we are not a normal company. We don't intend to become one. And we're going to invest a lot of money in things that are not going to make short-term return for shareholders. And if you're not comfortable with that, don't buy our stock. We're going to continue to reward and treat our people well. If you're not happy with that, don't buy the stock. Let's talk about sort of the importance of debate. Like another problem of move fast and break things is that there's no time for discussion. In order to really innovate, you need to create time and space for discussion.
Everything we were just talking about is exactly what was on my mind. There are people who have really good arguments for why Khan Academy should or shouldn't do something. to your point, I don't think it's just the attitude. It's also size. The
Yeah.
larger the organization gets, the harder it is to have debates with the people whose arguments are going to move the needle, maybe is a better way to
Yeah.
say it. It's not about the
Yeah.
people who matter, but it's about the arguments that they're able to make. And so as a result, you wind up with, and I think this was some of what was in Careless People, is like you wind up with these sort of like echo chambers, like tiny echo chambers inside the company where there's reinforcement of bad behavior because they're not listening to other people. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
They're not inviting the disagreement. They're not inviting the debate.
For folks who are not familiar with Careless People, this is a book. You want to talk about Careless People for a second?
Oh, no, you go ahead. You got it.
It is a book. It's sort of a memoir written by a former Facebook employee. Describes in great detail some of the problems with the way the systems worked and the negative impact on all of us, the negative side effects that all of us are bearing the cost of these negative externalities that are created by the way Facebook's system works. Meta sued the author and prevented her from talking about her book, so we're trying to talk about her book for her. It also prompted me to read Frances Hogan's book, The Power of One, which is also a great explanation of how these systems work and what we could do to make them not create these terrible negative side effects for society. And begs a lot of questions like why Facebook isn't already doing these things. And I think part of the answer is that there's no public debate
Right.
about how their algorithm should work. And there's no sense that there should be a public debate about that.
And I think even to some extent, there's very limited internal debate. If you're a free market capitalist believer, the idea is that people can have an opinion about this and they can vote with their money. They can basically say, I'm not going to give my money. That to some extent is undone by the business models that they've created, which is essentially monetizing. They don't charge us to access the content. They charge advertisers to support the platforms. Right before we got on the podcast, we were talking about, should we continue to post on Facebook and Instagram? What's interesting about that debate is it's hard to affect a real protest. The consequences are fairly delayed for a company like Facebook. It would take one massive movements of people away from the platform to start to have a noticeable negative impact on their revenue. And that's different, right? Like, when Tylenol had to recall, this is like in the 70s or something, like people stopped buying Tylenol. The money dried up.
Although if even 10% of the people who contribute, I mean, most Facebook users are readers, not writers.
That's right.
If only 10% of the people who actually post to Facebook quit posting, that would have a huge and very quick problem. In fact, I had two ahas when I read these two books, Careless People and The Power of One. Aha was that part of the reason why Facebook started advocating, Frances Hogan explains, started pushing more polarizing content in their platform is that it got more engagement. And people who were contributing content were slowing down. They weren't contributing as much content because they weren't getting so many reactions from people. And they found that when they promoted in their algorithm more extreme content, it got more engagement. And then people started, it was really a vicious cycle. Even if you didn't believe these extreme things, or if you were writing headlines, for example, you started writing these clickbait headlines. That's one real problem. The other thing, and maybe this is just my own stupidity, why do they allow all these political ads? It's not that much money. Why don't they just disallow them? What I realized was they allow them because now they are kingmakers. Now they can help you get elected or unelected. And so no official dares regulate Facebook because Facebook can prevent them from getting elected. This is a huge dampening on democratic debate about the ways that we should regulate the content on Facebook, Instagram, Meta. That was, I don't know why I didn't realize that before, but I'm like, oh, of course. So that is important to think about.
There's multiple layers of which we needed debate and we didn't have it. Internally, I'm sure there were people who were like, we should not be doing this. The engagement thing is good. in the sense that we're getting more people to write, but it's bad in the sense that the content is worse and people feel worse about it. I'm sure there were people making that argument inside of
Yes.
Facebook as they were
Yeah, of
deciding to do
course.
this. And then there was a public debate where the public having an opinion about whether or not this is, or the broader market having an opinion about whether or not what they're doing is good or should continue, doesn't really happen or doesn't feel like it should happen.
The
So like,
public democracy
yeah,
level debate. It feels to me like there's a move to just do away with, I don't want to have the debate at all, so let's arm democracy. That is very worrisome. There was a key moment in my career where somebody raised the issue of the importance of having public debate about decisions. This is when I was working at Google. I was managing the AdSense Online team. I was also in charge of policy enforcement and creating policy. At the same time that I was trying to grow revenue, I was also in charge of terminating AdSense publishers who violated Google's policies. And this goes back to the measurement problem. It did not matter how fast it grew, how much money AdSense made, did not specifically impact my compensation. That may seem sort of nutty, manage someone who was in charge of sales and operations, but there was an understanding at Google that if we measured things that narrowly, we were going to get the wrong kinds of behaviors. I was equally as passionate about taking down the sites that were violating policy as I was about growing revenue. And I was really excited about growing revenue, believe me. I really believed that you weed your garden. And if you allow your garden to get overrun by weeds, that's not good for your garden long term. Understand why that doesn't happen more at Facebook, because it's possible to create a system where people are caring about both of these things. So I thought I was doing a great job. That's the TLDR there. But then I was invited to speak at this class called Liberation Technology at Stanford. It was taught by Josh Cohen, who is an old friend of mine. I was describing to him content moderation challenges, this big debate I had had. And we had the debate at Google around Blogger, which I also managed for a while. There was somebody had written something calling for genocide, basically, kill all the ABC people. I wanted to take it down. I believed that kind of content had no part in the AdSense network. I was just going to pull it down. But I didn't have unilateral decision-making authority. This was something that had to be discussed more broadly. I was in this big meeting. At one point, Eric Schmidt sort of agreed with me. He said, if we had a dance hall and not Blogger, we would not rent it out to the KKK. Like, why would we allow this kind of content on it? And yet both Eric and I got overruled by the free speech crowd. In retrospect, I think I was right and I wish I had fought harder, but these are hard questions. Their point of view was that you're better off knowing who believes these things and who's saying it than not knowing, forcing this kind of stuff to go underground. In the end, if memory serves, we put a content warning. We left the site up, but we put a content warning saying things like, this is bad. And I was talking about this in the class, thinking we had a pretty good debate process. I'll never forget, Josh looked at me and said, "You are making those decisions?" At first, I was kind of insulted. I'm like, "What's wrong? What? Of course not. Like, why am I not qualified?
What's wrong with me?" Yeah.
And he was like, "You are totally unqualified to make this." Once I got over feeling kind of offended, because this was the most interesting part of my job, hands down. I really did care about it. But Josh said, and now I think he's right, like, these decisions, that there needs to be some democratic oversight to these kinds of decisions because they have such a huge impact on our whole society. Josh was right. I was wrong. But at the time, I was like, "Oh, Josh, you don't understand. The government could never be involved in these kinds of decisions." We had a policy about no porn sites. And some clever person took a picture of himself in front of a toaster as though it was a toaster. But of course, the toaster was very shiny and he was naked. There were ads for bestiality showing up on a parenting magazine that was an AdSense publisher. And obviously, they were very upset about this BC ad. I called up the ad content moderation team. They were reviewing all the ads. And I was saying, why are these ads even showing up anywhere? We have a policy against porn ads. this person claimed that bestiality didn't count as porn. I was like, that was not on my bingo card today. So anyway, I told these stories and they all got a big laugh, and nobody really stopped to think about, should we have democratic oversight over some of these decisions? I now believe we should. Josh Cohen was right.
I'm not arguing against it, but I think that it's so much harder in practice to achieve the goal of oversight. Here, just to give your team credit for a second, I think your team probably thought about these things very seriously and maybe even put time into
And
thinking.
the CEO of the company was willing to spend his time on this. Google took this very seriously.
Right. And I guess like my experience with, I don't know exactly how you encourage that kind of debate and at what level and who gets involved outside of these companies. I'm open to the idea, but I'm just recognizing the practical challenge of the fact that everybody else who would be contributing to that conversation would either need to be paid by Google or would be doing it on a volunteer base. Like they'd be volunteering their time to do this thing. And that is part of the reason why the public debate hasn't been vigorous about this stuff, is because it's like, how do you make the time to really understand what's going on? And instead of public debate, what we get is hot takes. We get is one person saying something which is missing a whole bunch of context, but it's sort of punchy. As a result, a bunch of people are like, yeah, I agree with that person. And then the other person sort of fires back and their thing also misses a bunch of context. And as a result, we're not really having a debate. We're just sort of like throwing barbs at each other.
Debate certainly should not happen on social media. It needs to happen in a different way.
What you're describing is sort of the third pillar of avoiding the pitfalls of move fast and break things, which is having the right kind of culture. The systems weren't perfect. There's been some external involvement, but I do think this idea that we're going to have a public debate. I'm not going to give unilateral decision-making power to the person who's technically in charge of this. We're going to force a public debate on this. And there's going to be a record of that debate. Like we're actually going to record this thinking for posterity. Those are important cultural rituals that I think don't exist in a lot of organizations. Going back to your original point, it's one of the reasons why, without ritualizing debate and saying this is an important part of how we make decisions as an organization, without removing unilateral decision-making power and setting that as a cultural touchstone, it's very easy for the necessity of the moment to overtake good thinking. Like things feel urgent, and as a result, people don't slow down to have the debate. More than that, without creating those cultural norms, it also discourages people from talking about mistakes they make. When you combine those things together, no culture of debate and no discussion of mistakes, it becomes very easy to see how you could go very deep down a rabbit hole of bad things happening. People sort of looking around being like, whose job is it to put the brakes? Like, what is the way that we respond collectively to these bad decisions or bad behavior that we're observing? I think a lot of cultures would benefit from the removal of unilateral decision-making power and a push toward public debate on important decisions.
There's a conference room at Meta right next to Zuckerberg's office that says good news only. That's an example of the wrong kind of culture. Like, don't tell me what's wrong, like you've got to have that culture where leaders are soliciting feedback and are eager to hear the bad news and the contrary point of view, not the good news only kind of culture. And I think it's really important that companies be willing, and this is something that tech companies have not traditionally been willing to do, to be held accountable by the public, by the government. There's a reason why we have all these NDAs and agreements that don't allow you to sue, that forced arbitration agreements. This is an example of a culture trying to avoid being held accountable by our government, by the systems we have in place to hold wealthy, big companies accountable.
All right, let's summarize our guidance for people who want to move fast, but don't want to break things in an irreparably bad way.
So tip number 1, consider the cost of failure. Don't skip the debate phase and build a team culture that supports both speed and learning.
Tip number 2, moving fast and breaking things isn't inherently good or bad. It's about applying a thoughtful approach in the right context with the right process, making sure that you slow down enough to debate something to make sure that you're still on the right track.
And tip number 3, always focus on learning. The whole point of moving fast and potentially breaking things is to learn fast. It's not to create a land grab and establish a monopoly that then destroys democracy.
And with that, we invite you to head over to radicalcandor.com/podcast to see the show notes for this episode. Remember, praise in public and criticize in private. If you like what you hear, please rate, review, and follow us on whatever platform you like to listen to your podcasts. If you have feedback, please email it to us at podcast@radicalcandor.com. Until next time.
By the way, if you have feedback on whether you think we're going to invite some public debate, do you think that we should stop posting on Instagram and Facebook? Let us know your thoughts. We are eager for them. Thank you.